There are both in and out of universe answers to explain why Android 19 is weaker than Android 17 and 18, even though theoretically you would guess, based off of his production number, that he would be a completely superior model. Now, the first thing that we have to understand is that when dealing with Android 19 and even dealing with Android 20, Dr. Gero himself, what we have to remember is that there was a major retcon that took place in Dragon Ball. And essentially, you're going to see a picture on your screen that describes the interview itself, but basically, to give you a rundown, what had happened was Toriyama was essentially planning on making androids 19 and 20 the main villains of the Android arc. Those were originally supposed to be the main villains of the Android arc, which is why if you look at the manga panel on your screen right here, you could even see, even in original text, even though it's translated, that Trunks originally said androids 19 and 20. And of course, when this scene happened in both the manga and the anime, this was way before the history of Trunks came in to even add more details off of what happened in Trunks' story. So as a result of this, because 19 and 20 were originally intended to be the main villains, something later on happened. And basically, Toriyama had a former editor by the name of Torishima. And he wasn't Toriyama's editor at the time, but he specifically was rather critical of Toriyama's decisions during the arc. He basically said that 19 and 20 were basically a geezer and a fatso, and then when 17 and 18 showed up, he basically just said, oh wow, so you're just gonna bring in a bunch of teenagers and brats to carry out this arc. And then when that didn't work out, Toriyama eventually brought out Cell, which eventually ended up being the main villain of the arc itself. So this is rather straightforward and simple. Toriyama effectively had to make 17 and 18 stronger than 19 and 20 because since he originally intended for 19 and 20 to be the main villains, if you're going to make stronger, more relevant villains afterwards and then reset the numbers that they're actually going down instead of going up, then you have a situation based off of out-of-universe reasons to change the story effectively why Android 19 was weaker than 17 and 18. And in addition to this, due to alternate timeline effects, Android 16 eventually ended up being an additional android that showed up in a situation where nobody ever expected him to. So you can essentially throw 16 into the mix to explain why he himself was not only stronger than 19 and 20, but also stronger than 17 and 18 for the exact same reasons. If you're going to create a brand new character and add all this mystique and mystery behind him, then it would make logical sense to make 16 a much stronger android than 17 and 18, which Toriyama obviously did. But apart from the out-of-universe explanations, there are in-universe reasons that make perfect sense as to why Android 19 was weaker than 17 and 18. And the first thing that we have to remember is that Dr. Gero openly admitted that he had issues controlling them before. Now, when you think about it from Gero's perspective, if he's in a situation where he's going to give androids complete free will that are effectively stronger than himself, what would be the most logical thing for him to do? Well, the most logical thing for him to do would be to create an android that would completely listen to him. And we actually see this directly in the show, even though it wasn't shown on screen, it was obviously explained off screen. And it was the mere fact that Android 19 was actually the model that converted Dr. Gero into an actual android. And this would make logical sense because the last time that 17 and 18 had seen Dr. Gero, he was clearly in his human state, which meant that they were deactivated for quite a while, to the point where Dr. Gero had enough time to not only build 19, but to build 19 in a way that 19 knew how to completely turn him into an android. Which brings us to our next main point, because Dr. Gero openly said himself that he is stronger than the Android 19 model. Now let's think about this logically. Dr. Gero made a huge mistake earlier, where he basically made 17 and 18 to have free will that were stronger than himself, and this is obviously a huge conundrum for Dr. Gero because not only are his androids disobedient, but they're also stronger than him. So, in the worst case scenario, he wouldn't be able to actually stop his own creations, whereas in the case of Android 19, because he's weaker than Dr. Gero, if he ever malfunctioned and stopped listening to him for whatever reason, Dr. Gero can overpower him himself, and that was essentially the huge reason why Android 19 was considered a perfect success. Not that he was stronger than his previous models, but the fact that Dr. Gero actually had complete control over him even though the power was clearly reduced. But unfortunately, when we analyze this logically, it also highlights another major mistake that Dr. Gero made, and that is the mere fact that when he was essentially programmed into Android 20, he still didn't make himself stronger than 17 and 18, and once again, he had another chance to do it, where effectively the first time he wasn't an android at all, so he really had absolutely no chance against his own creations. And then the second time around, when he actually becomes an android, he's still weaker than his own creations, which is a major problem. And we also have to remember that Dr. Gero eventually wanted to use 17 and 18 for Cell's complete evolution. And this was a rather perfect way to justify their usage to Dr. Gero, because from his perspective, he can never fully control them, so he really had nothing better else to do with them than essentially merge them into Cell and create a much more powerful android later on in the future, having no sympathy or empathy for his own creations. And ultimately, this would all explain why Android 19 was the perfect model for Dr. Gero, because it would show that even if 19's not the strongest, if he is completely obedient, and Dr. Gero can trust 19 to do surgery on him at any moment's notice, it would make him a much more effective model when compared to Dr. Gero's other models that were not only stronger, but completely disobedient, which were a significantly greater threat than 19 would ever be. And that's why Android 19 is weaker than the other androids.